Welcome to an Introduction to Economics by David Hopcroft of Parkbench Tutors. This podcast is the second of two podcasts on utility and demand. In our first podcast on utility and demand, we introduced the idea of indifference curves and a budget line. In this second podcast, we shall continue to develop those ideas. The table shows the quantity of X and the quantity of Y that can be bought with a given income of $100. We are looking at the combinations available when the consumer is choosing between the two goods. The budget line is the line we obtain from plotting the combinations of the quantity of X that can be purchased against the quantity of Y that can be purchased. Now let us consider the effect of a change in income. Suppose that the consumer has a rise in income from $100 to $200. The table shows the new combinations that are available. As before, we plot these on a graph to show the new budget line. Our interest is in seeing how these budget lines compare and how they are related to the indifference curves. Let us put all of this information onto the same map. We now have a map that shows the effect of an income change. With an increase in income, the consumer equilibrium point has shifted from A to B. Remember that the consumer equilibrium point is where the budget line is just tangent to the highest indifference curve that can be reached. It is the point where we say the consumer is maximizing utility subject to budget constraint. When income is increased, the budget line shifts, and the new consumer equilibrium point is at B. If the income had been reduced, we should have had a new consumer equilibrium point at C. The line CAB is the income consumption curve. It shows the consumer demand for two goods with varying income. Now let us consider the effect of a price change. Let us assume that both good X and good Y are at $20 and the income was $400. The table illustrates the combinations that are available. The first line shows the effect before a price change. If the price of X now falls, then more of X is consumed, and so there will be a shift to the right. Notice that the shift is to a line that is less steep. How will this affect the consumer equilibrium point? The consumer equilibrium point moves to the right, along the green dotted line that is shown on the map. When X is relatively cheaper, then Y is relatively more expensive. The consumer substitutes X for Y. This is known as the substitution effect of the price change. For a normal good, when the price of X falls, then we expect to see a shift to the right. Does this hold true for all goods? In an earlier podcast, we talked of Giffen goods or inferior goods. If consumer income rises, the consumer may choose to buy less of X, giving a decrease in the consumption of X, and this would cause a shift to the left. We can use these ideas to draw demand curves. The map here shows the effect of reducing the price of X for a normal good. The line shifts or pivots from DE to DF to DG. This gives a price consumption line passing through the points of P1, P2 and P3. Now suppose we take those points P1, P2 and P3, which represent three different prices of X, and plot them against the quantities of X at each price. The quantities are Q1 for price P1, Q2 for price P2, and Q3 for price P3. We have now produced the demand curve for a normal good. How would a Giffen good be affected? The line would pivot from YG to YF to YE. It would pivot towards the left. Taking the points where the budget line is just tangent to the indifference curve, we have the points to draw the demand curve. In this case, for a Giffen curve, note that the demand curve slopes from right to left. Let us introduce a new idea. We assumed previously that if the price of a good were, say, $4, then a consumer would be willing to pay $4. Suppose that the consumer would have been prepared to pay $9 for that unit. Suppose the consumer would have been prepared to pay $8 for the next unit, $7 for the third unit, and so on. The difference between these is called the consumer surplus. The area below the demand curve and above the price line will be the measure of this consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is an indicator of the gap between the total utility derived from a good and the actual market value of a good. This concept will be looked at again when we consider taxes and quotas. Another idea that is used in economics is that consumers will choose a collection of goods that they prefer. This is known as the theory of revealed preference and was proposed by Paul Samuelson. All that is assumed in this theory is that a consumer will behave in a consistent manner. Suppose AB represents a budget line. C is the point that represents the combination of X and Y that the consumer prefers to all other combinations. If the price of X falls, then the budget line shifts to AB dashed. The income effect of the price change is eliminated by moving the line back to A dash B double dash, which is parallel to AB dashed. Since the consumer had already chosen point C, then the new choice will be somewhere along the line CB double dashed. Let us say point D. So the movement from C to D is the substitution effect. The point about this theory is that it does not make use of the idea of utility, which is an abstract concept. Rather more useful is an idea by Lancaster. What happens when a consumer is choosing between two brands of the same good? There are many models of automobile. How does the consumer choose? The Honda Accord and Toyota Camry compete in the same market, and the consumer must choose. Lancaster simply proposed that goods have characteristics, and that the consumer makes a choice based on a collection of characteristics. So, if we apply this to our earlier ideas, the consumer is attempting to maximize the utility derived from the characteristics of the goods rather than from the goods themselves. We have looked at approaches to consumer behavior and the proposition that if the price of a normal good falls, then there is an increase in the quantity of that good demanded. This ends the second podcast on utility and demand, brought to you by Park Bench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. Thank you for watching and for listening. We wish you every success in your studies.